Stardew Valley experience begins with a simple gesture shaped by love. You inherit a farm from your dying grandfather. You don't build it, nor purchase it, nor earn it through visible labor or exchange, at least not any more so than any of the other Jojacor workers at the start of the game. You arrive after the fact of its abandonment, and it becomes yours. That detail, which seems like narrative convenience, quietly defines everything that follows. Because what you're given is not a blank slate, but a space shaped by absence, a place where productivity once existed and has now fallen into disrepair. Your role isn't to create something new, but to restore something that's been left behind, to make it functional again. The farm, at first glance, feels like freedom. You choose what to plant, how to organize, what rhythm to follow, but that choice exists within a framework. Every day is segmented into hours. Every action consumes energy. Movement becomes a cost measured against output. Even without external pressure, the system generates its own logic. What's efficient, what's optimal, what can be done before the day ends. Over time, this logic shapes behavior, not through force, but through repetition. You stop thinking only in terms of possibility and begin thinking in terms of return. The farm stops being just a space. It becomes a system, one that doesn't command you, but rewards certain patterns until they feel natural. Efficiency isn't demanded, it becomes instinct. And because there's no visible authority enforcing this, it feels peaceful, but peace and structure aren't opposites. Sometimes, peace is just what structure feels like when it no longer resists you. The land reinforces this feeling. It's overgrown, fragmented. Clearing it feels like restoration, but also transformation. Stones are removed, trees are cut, soil is tilled. What was idle becomes productive space. This act carries a quiet assumption. Unorganized space isn't neutral. It's waiting to become useful. And this is where inheritance matters. You don't earn the farm through struggle or negotiation. You inherit it through absence, and that absence implies a prior system of use. You're not building a new world. You're continuing one that was interrupted. Even the economy of the game reflects this continuity. Money is a measure of output. Time is a measure of efficiency. Resources become part of cycles. Crops grow, are harvested, sold, and replaced. Everything orients towards accumulation. But none of this is framed as exploitation. There's no factory, there's no wage labor, no external pressure demanding output. Instead, labor becomes routine. You water crops, you tend animals, you gather resources. These actions feel less like work and more like care, but they still produce value, and that value still accumulates. This is where the tension of the game becomes interesting. What the game removes in coercion, it replaces with coherence. Actions feel meaningful, not because they're demanded, but because they fit into the system where repetition yields visible growth. Even relationships follow this pattern. Gifts, time spent together, and emotional closeness all build through consistent interaction. It's not reduced to cold numbers, but it's still structured by progression, and progression is always a form of accumulation. This brings us to the game's community structure. You, the player, are positioned as the central agent of restoration. The farm thrives through your labor and only your labor. The town's revitalization depends on your choices. Others contribute, but only in response to what you initiate. The villager Penny stands in stark contrast within this system. She is one of the hardest working characters in the game, yet she occupies one of the lowest economic rungs in the town. Only Linus, who exists outside of the system entirely, is more marginalized. Penny works tirelessly, caring for the town's children, and more crucially taking on the responsibility of looking after her mother Pam, who lives somewhere between problem drinker and flat-out alcoholic. Penny's labor, however, goes largely unrecognized within the game's economic framework. While the player's labor directly translates into financial rewards and visible progress, Penny's selfless care receives little in acknowledgement. Despite her efforts, Penny doesn't earn money or accumulate wealth. She isn't rewarded through the system of production that the game prioritizes. In fact, the closest she comes to recognition is when you, the player, as the de facto richest member of the town, chooses to marry her and improve her living conditions. Only then does her situation improve, but even this is framed as a personal reward for the player, not a societal acknowledgement of her labor. This highlights an important critique. Penny's work, though essential to the town's well-being, isn't considered productive in the economic sense. While the player is praised for farming, mining, and earning money, Penny's labor, largely invisible and unpaid, is relegated to the background unless the player steps in to change her circumstances. Penny's position underscores how certain types of labor, particularly caregiving, are undervalued in both Stardew Valley and, by extension, in many real-world systems. She's maintaining social stability, nurturing future generations, and managing an unstable household, yet her contributions don't fit within the game's rewarding cycle of production. It's a stark contrast to the player experience, where every action is a step towards accumulation. At some point, honestly, it might be worth returning to examine these characters in their own terms, especially Linus. There's something structurally fascinating about his position in relation to society. He's not fully inside, but he's not fully outside either. The tension between his role and how the world perceives him could support a much closer reading in the future, but I digress. The Joja Mart route further clarifies the system, not as a separate system, but a stripped-down version of the same logic. Its efficiency without narrative framing, progress measured in corporate milestones instead of community effort. Restoration is achieved through direct financial exchange rather than through distributed contribution. But crucially, both paths, both the Joja Mart and the community center, produce the same outcome. The town is restored, systems resume, economic activity continues. Only the framing differs. Framing is powerful. It determines whether accumulation feels like care or extraction. This is one of the game's most interesting design choices. It doesn't eliminate economic logic. It anesthetizes it. It relocates accumulation into a space where it feels personal, self-directed, and peaceful. Labor remains, but it's experienced as rhythm. Value grows, but it feels like cultivation, not extraction. In Stardew Valley, the player becomes both worker and beneficiary of the system. Ultimately, the game doesn't critique or celebrate any real-world system directly. It explores how structure feels when coercion is removed, but logic remains, how labor persists without the appearance of compulsion, how accumulation can feel like care when it's embedded in routine and restoration. But this is an idealized version of accumulation, one that's detached from the exploitation and coercion that often defines real-world systems. In Stardew Valley, the labor doesn't feel like extraction because it's growth. It's a system of accumulation that exists within a peaceful, almost utopian environment. Unlike real-world systems that often rely on labor under pressure or necessity, this version of accumulation is framed as nurturing rather than exploitative. It's structure without the visible weight of its own harsher conditions. watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I have always had a firm love of literary analysis, especially when misapplied to things that don't have a single rigid structure. As always, I might not know you, but I love you. Thanks for dropping by. Stay safe out there.